What's up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we're coming at you each and every week with a fresh weekend of debrief and an effort to send biblical truth. What better way to do that than by the power of conversation? I'm one of your hosts, Caleb Pearson. Joining me again in the host spotlight, this dude, you're the man, Mark Francis.
What is up?
Mark, how you doing, buddy?
Doing great.
Good.
Loving life today. I don't know why. It's
exciting.
It's a busy, good season of life right now. So
spring is about to have sprung. It's going to be very fun.
Yeah, but we're all wearing kind of like bluey colors here if you're watching on YouTube, you know. Yeah. So we're not necessarily blue, but
one theme, United Front.
It's okay. It's good.
Thanks for being here, dude.
Yep,
appreciate it. He's back with us, the man, the myth, Mark Carey. Mark, how you doing, my friend?
Very well.
Good. Thank you for being here, uncovering Daniel. MF, let me come your way first, dude.
Yeah.
As this series, some people get a giggle out of the fact that I call you that. I will never stop. So we're just it's where we are.
It's acceptable.
Unpacking Daniel.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this weekend, what stood out, and then Mark will see what you have for us to elaborate on and go from there.
Well, so many things keep standing out for me on Daniel, and I'll just say big picture. I haven't been on since we've really truly begun unpacking Daniel, and I wanted to always say, this is like a movie or a short series saga ready to be made in a real way. I mean, it is. I mean, all of the fads and trends of making movies these days, whether it's Star Wars or the new Dune movie or all these, like Gladiator, all these just movies of this big epic like genres. This is the story to tell. There's so many things here that we're going to unpack in the whole book of Daniel, and we've barely just started to scratch the surface. But when you think about, you referenced Risk a couple of weeks ago of just kings and kingdoms and people taking over people, and that is just fascinating.
Or Cecil B. DeMille's when you need them.
Right, exactly.
Or Dallas Jenkins. Next one.
Let's get through the 7 seasons of Chosen, and then he can move on to Daniel and have 7 seasons of Daniel. Yeah. That'd be cool. Well, I say all that because just where we are and just understanding the history, and then also looking at the spiritual component, I think is more fascinating. And you can think that the kings and kingdoms and all that stuff is kind of cool and storytelling, but there was this real people going through real things. And can you imagine living in that time where you're a Jew and you're getting taken into captivity, or you're there in Babylon and there's this crazy king and just power hungry, and you're living in subjection under the king to do whatever they want to do. That's me right now. I'm visualizing myself in this world. And I've read through the whole book of Daniel a couple months ago to prep for this, and reading it through again now. It's just more real to think of the spiritual factors that are at play. And Mark, what you were sharing is, man, somebody was pouring into Daniel to give him this level of faith back when he was a child. And I was just thinking knee-jerk, well, he's got some pretty good parents. But you were referencing there's probably things even beyond that. That was kind of a neat nugget, eye-opening to say, you're right, there's some sort of discipleship component that was going on with Daniel to bring him as a 15, 16, 17-year-old to have such great faith and trust in the sovereign God. Yeah. And so having the personal attention given to Daniel in this makes me then think, man, where's everybody else in this story? Where are they at? And not many Jews were there standing up to help him, So I'm just visualizing the movie in my mind as we go through it.
And Sight and Sound's doing it, I think.
Yeah,
too.
That's true.
So it's cool timing for people to see the media of it. So, Mark, with that being said, we're in Daniel 2, kind of a larger chunk of passage to cover in a weekend. And what sort of stood out in your study? What do you like? Man, I would have loved more time to elaborate on that. And what has that been like for you lately?
Well, narrative literature is. It is fun to read, like you're saying, Mark, and there's so many different gaps or things that aren't included that are assumed behind the scenes. The problem is that it just leads to pure speculation, and so you can't. It's hard to preach that. I was at the end, and you're just kind of referring to it, Mark, is the role maybe Habakkuk played.
Right.
Similar time, I'm looking at, I've been reading a little bit of Ezekiel, because Ezekiel was another one of those who was taken captive, and he's there in Babylon too as he's writing his prophecies. So God didn't fill us in on a lot of those. And but I'm wondering, how was it that Daniel, as a young kid, could live with such a strong faith? When it says in verse 14 of chapter 2 that when he replied to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had come to kill him, how he responded, it said he replied with discretion and discernment, with tact, with wisdom, with I'd say grace, and he chose his words wisely. It's just such an amazing thing for a young person to do that. We already know that Daniel's three friends stood head and shoulders above others. So there may have been just some natural abilities. But God chose Daniel in this role not arbitrarily. There was God had prepared him for this very hour. And what all involved in that was, I don't know, but I was struck with Habakkuk, who struggled with this whole thing of the Babylonians coming and God just saying, the just shall live by faith. And I have to believe that Habakkuk took what God had taught him and somehow poured it into some other people's lives. Maybe it was Daniel's parents. Maybe it was a small group, a discipleship group. Maybe it was the youth group of 5 teens or 4 teens that Habakkuk was training. But you first of all, you can't impart what you don't possess. Habakkuk must have possessed something. Somebody possessed something to impart it, so that I'm sure they would have loved to had 10 more years of pouring into Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah's life. But they didn't. And Nebuchadnezzar came, and the armies of Babylon came, and all of a sudden they're gone. And just right when they're in their prime of life, and maybe the prime of discipling them, they're gone. And there's a very good chance that Daniel's parents or his mentor or whether it might have been Jeremiah, we don't know, but they may never have heard again. They until they got to heaven to hear the rest of the story. We get to see the rest of the story, and I just think this wasn't said, but I think it's an important part of what could have been said in that message, is that we need to seize the moment. We need, in terms of our own personal walk with the Lord, and be prepared to be people who live by faith. And that means knowing a God well enough that we can trust him. And that was certainly the case with Daniel. But we need to also redeem the time, because the days are evil, in terms of parents training up your children the way they should go, or pouring into someone else's life in a discipleship group, or time is clicking away. And this world, we don't know what's going to happen. And all of a sudden it'll be over. And or those kids will be off to college, or whatever it might be. And there's just, I think that there's behind the scenes of this whole Daniel stories is this sense of urgency of preparing so that we can deploy. And we don't know when that deployment may come. But Daniel and his friends, Daniel was ready, and he rose to the occasion, and God used him in a very powerful way. That struck me significantly in going through this chapter, in chapter 2. His dependence upon the Lord. He had such confidence that God was going to reveal the dream. He goes to the king. I mean, it was almost as if Daniel knew that he was raised up for such a time as this. And but he didn't. And we'll see in the chapter 3 with the fiery furnace, the Lord God can deliver us, but if not, I mean, they didn't know.
Right.
And Daniel probably didn't know, he could go before the king and he could have been killed right then. I mean, there's just this boldness because of God to do, as the old song says, to dare to be a Daniel. And that kind of resolve and boldness and courage in light of who God is, that and the faith, the just shall live by faith, is astounding in this chapter.
Well, I think it's fascinating to watch the four of them, essentially, Daniel and his three friends, kind of get rushed into adulthood a little bit, or in the sense of, okay, the rubber's going to meet the road. You have an opportunity to, how much of this is your own? Because there's a biblical example now for somebody or a teenager in today's day and age who gets thrusted into adulthood quickly, or in the home there's a responsibility that happens maybe sooner than they anticipated, or whatever. The B, I think, reality to that, along with that, would be the world is inundating kids younger and younger with crazy messages and stuff, and so I think there's certain merit to starting to talk to our kids like they're adults to a certain regard, with spiritual things in mind. So that by the time things do happen to them, there's not a foundation of crisis that is the spiritual building, but there's the stability of faith, so that when the crisis comes, it's okay. This is what my dad was talking about.
And to say you can't hold up in this adverse culture, in this demonic culture in which we're living in. Well, no. Look at Daniel. He did, and so. When I went off to University of Nebraska just before the Earth's crust hardened, coming up, it was 50 years ago. It's a little different world, but it was still very sinful and evil in many ways. But I thrived in that environment because of the Christian fellowship and local church and different things. My kids went off to university, two of them did, and they thrived in that environment. Today, I keep thinking, man, I would never send my kids into that. It's a different ball game. Well, we may not ever send our kids into that. Maybe that's not, but it doesn't mean they couldn't thrive in it if they're well grounded.
But it still speaks to the being well grounded.
It does.
And so there's this implied narrative of what was going on behind the scenes in Daniel's world and life before he got to this point. And then even as the story continues, what else is he doing to pursue God and to grow in his faith? Because you can see it continues to grow. And so there is this continual pursuit of God that is there.
Yeah.
That's not word for word black and white scripture, but you can see the results of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's great application for us today, is that there's this continual desire that we should be growing in the knowledge of God and then pouring into our kids or others around us so they can be rooted and grounded. We've used those words before, to know that, okay, when times do come, when as Daniel is being faced with death potentially, I'm confident. There's that quiet confidence, that boldness and confidence.
It's a material example of preparing and deploying a disciple, right? And you talk about that parent-kid relationship. I mean, Sammy's coming up on 1 year old. Hannah and I are 6.5% done raising him, which I know is silly, stupid math, but it's weird that time does fly, in the sense of like, okay, I can see how this builds on itself. And you guys have both raised kids and sent them out, right? You're at this point where I can tell down the road, I will say time flies, and there's no time as good as now to start laying foundation. And man,
yeah. And I think what's encouraging, and someone had emailed you about this in verse 11, when the conjurers and the magicians and the Chaldeans were forced by Nebuchadnezzar to tell him my dream, and they just for the third time says, no one can do this, king. And it said in verse 11, moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult. There's no one else who could declare it to the king except God's. And the implication is, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. Like, we're not going to get anything from them, so to speak. And what came into my mind is you were mentioning that email. It's really a polemic here against those gods, because Daniel had a real understanding of the presence of God with him. So their gods do not dwell with mortal flesh. I mean, there would be this great chasm. And yet our God is a very present help in time of need. And all throughout the Old Testament, even though God dwelt in unapproachable light, there was this, you look at the life of Daniel or the life of David in the Psalms. Daniel would have known those Psalms. And here was David, who had a very personal, a man after God's own heart, a very personal walk and relationship with God. Against thee and thee only have I sinned, he said, when he sinned with Bathsheba. So there is this, their gods mentality. Psalm 103, 115, Psalm 115 says, their gods, they have mouths but they cannot speak, they have ears they cannot hear. You know, they're non-entities that are not anywhere a present impact in our life. But my God, you know, he's in the heavens, he does whatever he pleases, and he is compassionate and merciful, and he gives to his children what they need. I mean, he's an engaged God, and that comes out in this passage very strongly. And as we'll see next week, there is when Daniel comes before the king. In verse 27, he said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, or diviners are able to declare it to the king. Why? Well, for one thing, they're mortal men. And number two, to whom they're inquiring are lifeless gods.
Yeah.
However, he says in verse 20, there's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he's made it known. So there's this... there's this clear indicator that the God in heaven is our God, and he's personal, and I can't ever declare this, but this is what has been declared.
And what the note that the member dropped us was just kind of this cool thought that, yes, these gods don't have flesh, they're not mortals, but you can also look at even the sorcerers of the day recognize that there are deities out there who are more powerful than us humans. And yet the contrast is our one true God was more present and more relevant than these so-called deities that they were worshiping, that he had dwelt among the Israelites with tabernacle, and future he's going to put on flesh and dwell among us. So our God is the best of all of that, where you get a chance to see, yes, he is this ethereal, overseeing, sovereign, supreme God, but he also is present and immanent and personal, and something that their false gods could not even compete with, even though those false gods have their own powers. You know, there's the
demonic realm,
that you keep referencing. In that time, there's this demonic world that they were worshiping and is real in Babylon, just like you're referencing here in our world today. It's still there, but yet God's power is always going to trump that demonic power. But yet those guys, those magicians, recognize that even that demonic power is going to trump what they can do.
Yeah.
And so having a proper perspective of that, I think just our friend sending us in the line was saying it's just an interesting contrast to see who our real God is.
Well, it's a tale as old as time to be in culture where you can very easily be more spiritual but less religious than you ever were before. Colossians were wrestling with some of that. It's just so easy to sidestep what God's doing and look for the spiritual. And so I just love studying the Old Testament and being reminded, like, it truly does all come back to Christ, and how he fulfills all this stuff that we couldn't. He's present in all the stuff we didn't think about, and man, you do see that grand narrative being honored, and that's something I didn't really know was there or appreciate until much later in my walk with the Lord. Was like the Old Testament isn't isn't just full of important religious things, but it actually all is going to support and make the message of Christ seem sweeter. And it's not that God's changed his mind. The idea of two testaments, making it so easy for people to believe it's two very different gods or two very different things happening. You got humanity in both of them, and he comes at the beginning of the second
revelation of it all.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want to neglect talking about Daniel's response either, and that worshipful response that he's like, okay, God's going to give me this answer, and what does he do? Go straight to bless the name of the Lord and declare praise and worship and be like, you are the God among all gods, gives knowledge to men of understanding. And there's just this really cool worshipful response that instead of, like you referenced, what he could have done was go be like, I got the answers and look at me, I'm going to go run and solve all the world's problems. But he goes straight back to God with that response. And what we were able to do in the course of the entire 75-minute worship time, referencing a few of those little passages, I don't know if you guys caught that or not, throughout the singing time, was just really meaningful to me of rehearsing the gospel in light of what Daniel said in his worshipful response.
And they weren't empty, idle words. Their words, this song of praise was sung, was shared out of a sense of reality. They'd experienced this. This was something, they weren't just quoting something from a book or reading something from a worship page. They knew, they had just gotten the answer to this prayer. Their lives were now spared because God was gracious and compassionate. And so this praise flowed from a personal encounter with the living God that they had actually experienced, and how exciting it was. And that's before we, the readers, are even told what the dream was, what the interpretation. I mean, it's kind of a teaser.
You left us that cliffhanger.
Well,
you're like, we're not going to cover it today.
The text does too. It's just like, okay, well, what are you praising God for? What is it that he told you that leads to such profound? Because there is something back there. And so worship is a response to who God is and what God has done. It's a response to revelation about him. And when you personally encounter the living God and you personally are engaged with him, and this can be a bit mystical and maybe ethereal, but there are those moments where you encounter the living God, you can't help but respond in praise and worship, because it's real. They knew it was real because they had experienced it. So I think that we'll next week, we'll unpack why it was so meaningful and why they said what they said, because it's it's eye-opening. I did want to I mentioned this, just a couple of technical things. When it said the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, so he came to power when his dad died in 605. So you would think 604, 603, possibly when this took place. But Daniel and the boys are taken off in 605, that same year. And so they're in 3-year training. So it's possible, when it says second year of his reign, Daniel and the boys were still in the training. But it's more likely because there is this historical thing that the first year is really what was called the ascension year. So when they say year 1, that would have been really their second year of reign. And when it says year 2, is probably the third year, which means, again, the youthfulness of Daniel. I think he was in service. He had passed the test. He had finished the indoctrination program, and he is now, so we can get maybe tripped up over, it says when in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Either way, God was working, and even if it was Daniel still in training, it's still, but I think because he had just finished, because he'd been already interviewed by Nebuchadnezzar, when he goes in and says, I can interpret that dream for you. Just give me a moment so I can go pray. Nebuchadnezzar was willing to let him do that. The other thing I thought, that just like another technical thing, is in verse 4 it says, the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. And it's like, I'm not sure why that was included. Why Danny have to write that? Who cares what language they spoke to a king in? But starting at that verse, chapter 2, verse 4, all the way through the end of chapter 7, the text is in Aramaic. And so that's kind of a unique thing about Daniel. The first chapter and the first 3 verses are in the Hebrew language, and then starting again chapter 8 to the rest, the final 4 chapters, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 5 chapters, it's in Hebrew again. And people wonder, so what's the significance of that? And the answer probably is because what we are going to be reading here, Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the stories and the accounts all the way through the end of chapter 7, have to do with the Gentile world, prophecies about the Gentile world. You pick up in chapter 8 again, and the focus now becomes on Israel and God's prophecies towards Israel, and that's in the Hebrew tongue. And so, again, it's Daniel is a Jew living in a Gentile world, and as this is getting written and it's disseminated, probably the focus for the Gentile world is that God of Israel, that God of heaven, he's in charge of your existence as well. And then when he focuses on the Jews, then it's back to Hebrew. So I think that's kind of an interesting, little unique thing about Daniel. Doesn't make that big of a difference, I suppose, but it is unique.
So then, dumb question, but what language was Nebuchadnezzar speaking?
Probably
Babylon.
Probably Akkadian.
Okay, so this is a unique language.
Aramaic was, like I mentioned, was the lingua franca of the day. Everybody spoke Aramaic. So whether they did that in their normal home or Akkadian, I think, was the ancient language. Assyria goes back to even more ancient than that. So I'm not sure. They probably spoke Aramaic in their normal language, but Akkadian would have also been a language that the Babylonians would have known. So, yeah,
and a language that Daniel would have had to have learned. He probably, maybe as a child growing up.
Yeah, well, remember the cuneiform too. There was that Babylonian cuneiform, which has its roots in Akkadian language. So, a lot of times, nations will have their official language, but the
primary speaking is different.
Right.
Yeah.
So in Jesus' day, it was Aramaic,
right?
Greek, but they also knew Hebrew because the synagogues and would have been in Hebrew. So
People were so much smarter back then.
Oh man,
now.
Yeah.
we got high school kids be like, I can't believe I'm in Spanish too.
Yeah, right, for the 4th time.
Yeah, right. But good stuff, boys. Clearly the stories, crescendoing, and there's going to be a ton of cool testimonies, cool stories coming out of Daniel. Mark, Francis, what do we need to point people towards before we get out of here? Anything going on?
I mean, there's a couple things. I mean, first of all, we had a good baptism service this past weekend. So just a response of praise and celebrating what God's doing in the work of our body, and 6 different people getting baptized. So that's just a really neat opportunity. A bunch of people were able to show up and be a part of that. So thank you for being there. There is a children's ministry lunch happening on March 10th. So for any parents of kids, we're calling age 0 through elementary, come on out and just have some lunch together to further this whole partnering with parents theme that students and youth and children's ministry do. So you can register online for that. And Easter is right around the corner, guys.
It's in March. Yeah.
It's coming up. It's coming up. So just mark your calendars for when that is. It's a little bit earlier than normal, but Good Friday will be 2 different services for that, and then the 5 services over the weekend that we'll be providing. So it's exciting.
Yeah,
got a lot going on.
It's good.
Yeah. I'm tired already thinking about it.
Oh, don't tire out yet.
Yeah. Marks, thank you for being here, boys.
Yep.
Appreciate it. For all you listeners and viewers, remember that we love to hear from you. You can send over your thoughts, questions, or requests at fbcva.org/podcasts. Also, be sure to check out our YouTube channel and our other podcast venues as well. The fact of the matter, everybody, is that sermons are not meant to just take an hour, but rather transform a lifetime. Until next week, much love. God bless.